I am pleased today to convene the first hearing of this subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties for the 116th Congress. I look forward to working with Ranking Member Mike Johnson and other members of the subcommittee on the many challenging and pressing issues that we will be addressing in the months to come. It is fitting that our first hearing here will focus on the National Emergencies Act of 1976 and its implications for one of the core tenets of the Constitution's design, a governmental structure defined by checks and balances and the separation of powers, all from the brilliance of James Madison. The primary function of the Constitution assigns to Congress under Article I is the power to legislate, including the power to appropriate funds. As every grade school student, high school student, law student is taught, Congress writes the laws, while the President's job is to enforce them. We're also taught that Congress has the power of the purse. If the President wants to spend money for something, he or she needs to get funding from the legislative branch. That's Article I. Unfortunately, President Trump has undermined those basic principles. After making a campaign pledge to build a wall along our southern border, 2,000 miles long, and then promising that Mexico would pay for it, which was simply a device that his campaign folks gave him to remember to bring up the issue. And later it morphed into a policy design. He was met with the dose of reality. That was that Mexico was not going to pay for it, and that neither was Congress. Polls show that the American people do not want to pay billions of dollars for a vanity project when illegal immigration is historic lows, when a wall would do nothing to stop drugs being smuggled into our country, which come through our ports of entry by about a 90% amount, and when families fleeing violence need an orderly and humane system to process asylum claims, not a concrete wall. And there aren't women being duct taped over their mouths, legs immobilized, sex trafficked into our country. That's pure fantasy. That's why earlier this year, Congress rejected the President's request for $5.7 billion to build a border wall. In fact, President Trump did not even seriously pursue those billions of dollars during his first 2 years in office when his party controlled both houses of Congress. But the President doesn't not like getting his way. That is why 2 weeks ago, in a petulant action, he invented a so-called emergency to order to divert billions of dollars in military construction funds to build his wall. As Elizabeth Goitein, right? You got it. One of our witnesses will explain, this is the only time since the passage of the National Emergencies Act that a president has invoked emergency powers to thwart the express will of Congress. President Trump's actions undermine the basic separation of powers. It is not up to him to circumvent the funding directives that Congress has passed into law using its exclusive power of the purse. And it certainly is not up to him to use American taxpayer money to seize land from owners of private property for a project that Congress has not authorized him to build. The Supreme Court noted that when Harry Truman tried to take over the steel industries during the Korean War, and that was during a war, that he could not do it. It was an illegal use of that power. Congress, as a co-equal branch, cannot be silent in the face of this power grab. I was pleased with the House vote, 245 to 182 on Tuesday, to pass a joint resolution to terminate this so-called emergency. And I hope my colleagues in the Senate put constitutional principles above party loyalty and presidential fealty when they take a vote on this measure in the coming weeks. While I believe President Trump's emergency declaration is legally and substantively without merit, it also raises a number of broader questions about the National Emergencies Act and Congress's delegation of emergency authority. That's why it's important, even though we've had this vote, to have this hearing, because we need to see what is this act and does it need to be amended. The National Emergencies Act was enacted in 1976 in order to constrain the use of presidential emergency authorities. It does not give the president any particular powers, but it sets forth the process that he has to follow if he declares an emergency, and the process that we in Congress have to follow if we want that emergency to end. The law hasn't worked as intended. President Trump and his supporters believe that because the NEA, law setting out a procedural framework only, does not define what an emergency is, then the president is free to invent one whenever he wishes, a la King George. If we accept that view, then not even common sense or an English dictionary or the Constitution, which we swear to uphold, can act as a constraint. As to the underlying laws that give the president emergency authorities, a lot of scholars and commentators have pointed out that we in Congress have almost lost track of how many authorities we've granted to the president, or whether these grants of emergency authorities remain warranted. You're on. Goitein will describe some of those laws for us, many of which have never been used. Nonetheless, they remain on the books, and as Justice Robert Jackson put it in a famous dissent on a different emergency claim, they, quote, lie about a loaded weapon, lie about like a loaded weapon, unquote. Tellingly, after President Trump began talking in late 2018 about declaring a national emergency, a lot of lawyers and scholars spent weeks spinning their wheels trying to figure out which laws he was talking about. The president's own budget director told the press about how he and his staff combed through the U.S. Code looking for hidden emergency authorities or other loopholes that allow them to move money around. The American people deserve better than that. They deserve to know the president cannot rewrite the law or exploit obscure loopholes to raid funds that have been allocated by Congress for different purposes. And particularly when Congress has acted at the president's request, the president was going to accept what Congress gave him and then said no after he heard from talk show radio host. Then he'd shut down the government after Congress wouldn't give him his funds, and then after 3 weeks, Congress voted together in a bipartisan fashion to give him what funds they thought were appropriate, and then he declared a national emergency. He basically declared Congress null and void. So I look forward today to hearing from all of our witnesses who bring a range of perspectives about these issues. I hope we have a productive and fruitful discussion not only about President Trump's actions, but about whether we as Congress need to do more to constrain these type of authorities and amend this law so they're used only in true emergencies and not as an end run around our Constitution. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Johnson, from the Go Tigers State, for his opening statement.